Hello, this is CJ Baker, and this is episode 19 of the Ongoing History of Protest Music podcast, the companion podcast to the website Ongoing History of Protest Songs.com. Rolling Stone recently published a list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. They originally published the list in 2003 and a slightly updated version in 2012. This version was completely revamped. One of the criticisms of the original list was that it was too rock centric. It definitely leaned towards white male representation. Because of having a more diverse group of individuals involved in the selection process, the list is more diverse in comparison. Of course, any list is going to generate debates. Also, it's impossible to create a list without having some blind spots, which I will discuss in a bit more detail later on. When I was younger, I was really into music lists, and I would get worked up over the numerical placements and over who is excluded. My view of lists have now evolved. I now simply view lists as recommendations. It's a way of possibly introducing myself to a work I'm unfamiliar with, or maybe a work I've listened to in the distant past, but maybe it's time to revisit it with a new set of ears. So concerning this fact, the whole idea of numerical placements, they no longer really have any weight in from my perspective. So because of this, when I make year-end and decade list on my website, I no longer assign numerical values. Instead, I present them in either alphabetical or chronological order. So I'm not going to get worked up over the albums that made or didn't make the Rolling Stone 500 list. I'm not going to get worked up of where the albums ended up on the list. But I thought it would be interesting to highlight a few of the socially conscious albums that made the list. So the first one was listed at 487. It was by Black Flag. The album is Damaged and was released in 1981. So this is an important album in the development of hardcore punk. It's confrontational and it deals with anti-conformity themes. Also, the opening track, Rise Above, that song in particular is a fantastic fist-pumping anthem. The next album is by Fela Kuti in the Africa 70, Expensive Shit, which was released in 1975. So Fela Kuti is a very important figure, not only in socially conscious music, but he basically helped develop the genre of Afro music, like the genre referred to as Afro beats. So when we're talking about possible blind spots, there could be some argument whether or not this is even the best Fela Kuti album, and it's the only one that made the list. So one of the blind spots on this list is the fact that genres such as Afro beats and other world music genres are definitely underrepresented. But his music, Fela Kuti's music, is definitely worth checking out. Like one album I'd also recommend, which didn't make the list, is Zombie. And there's also a couple of really good compilations as well. So the next album on this list was 395 by D'Angelo and the Vanguard. The album is Black Messiah, which was released in 2014. So this album was also featured on the website's list of the best protest albums of 2010, or of the 2010s. So originally, the album was slated to be released in 2015, but after the controversial court decision to acquit the police officers who murdered Eric Garner and Michael Brown, D'Angelo rushed the release of this timely album. So the album deals heavily with the Black American experience, and it deals with themes connected with the Black Lives Matter movement. So sadly, it resonates even more with what's currently going on. So the next album is by Aretha Franklin, and the album was released in 1972, and it's her album, Young, Gifted, and Black. And this was actually her 19th album, so by this point, she was already considered a soul singing icon, and she was only 29 years old. So this is possibly her most socially conscious album. So the title track is a cover of the Nina Simone tune, and is also a poignant cover of Elton John's border song, Holy Moses in parenthesis, which is not necessarily a direct protest song, but it does address anti-immigration themes. So there is a couple of other Aretha Franklin albums on the list, most notably her 1967 Breakthrough album, or at least commercially breakthrough, because she had some success within the gospel genre prior to that. Breakthrough 1967 album, I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You, was number 13 on the 500 list, and that featured the classic empowerment anthem, Respect. And also, for socially conscious songs of Aretha Franklin, there's a list posted on the website as well. So the next album was 354 on the list by X-Ray Spex, Germ Free Adolescence, which was released in 1978. So this is an important album in the development of the Riot Girl movement, and it features themes of anti-conformity and anti-consumerism. Also, it wasn't on the original release, but most reissues feature the empowering feminist anthem, "Oh Bondage, Up Yours." So the next album is by Janet Jackson, and the album is Rhythm Nation 1814, which was released in 1989. So we might not always associate Janet Jackson with political music, but with this album, she intentionally set out to create a socially conscious album. And it is a catchy album of socially aware pop music. Also, back in the 90s, Jackson would joke that the title track could be the US national anthem. And then one day, she decided to look up the date that Francis Scott Key wrote the Star Spangled Banner, and she realized Key wrote the national anthem on September 14th, September 14th, 1814. So it was an accidental coincidence with the album title, Rhythm Nation 1814. But recently, there has been some discussion whether or not it's time to replace the national anthem when you consider the racist origins of the song. So if you are going to replace the national anthem, why not Rhythm Nation? So the next album on the list is by Solange, and it's A Seat at the Table, which was released in 2016. So this was 312 on the Rolling Stone list. It also made my 100 Best Protest Albums of the 2010s list. So this album deals with strong themes of women and Black empowerment. So the next album on the list is by Curtis Mayfield. There was 275 on the list. The album is Curtis, which was released in 1970. So back in the 60s, Curtis Mayfield was part of the Impressions who contributed soulful, gospel-infused civil rights tunes, such as People Get Ready and Keep on Pushing. So this album was Mayfield's solo debut, and the sound is definitely edgier and funkier, and the lyrics are a lot more politically direct. So along with this album, 76 on the list was another album by Curtis Mayfield. It was Superfly, which was the soundtrack to the blaxploitation film of the same name, and that also deals with a lot of socially conscious themes as well. So the next album on the list is 255. So Bob Dylan, the freewheeling Bob Dylan, which was released in 1963. So as you could suspect, there was a number of Bob Dylan albums on the list, but most of the albums that contained his more political material actually were excluded from the list. But this album, this was his sophomore album, and it actually features a trio of protest classics. So the album features Blowing in the Wind, Masters of War, and A Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall. So 3 absolute classics in the development of socially conscious music. So album 222 is the self-titled debut album by Rage Against the Machine, which was released in 1992. So I also previously discussed this album before on the podcast concerning 20 albums from the 90s which resonate with the current political climate. And it's also on my 100 albums list of the 90s, which will eventually be released on the website. So I'm not going to say too much more about it, but this is basically one of the most important political albums of all time. And I also can't think of an album that is this explicitly political that actually ended up achieving commercial success. So the next album on the list was 149. So it was by John Prine, his self-titled debut, which was released in 1971. So when he released this, he was still working for the US Postal Service, which we know is greatly maligned at the moment. So he died this year on April 7th due to complications from the coronavirus. But this album in particular featured several socially conscious songs, including some that were featured on a playlist that was posted on the website. So John Prine is someone that maybe commercial success eluded him, but he was definitely well respected critically and by other musicians. And one of the gifts he had was his ability to provide social commentary. So the next album was 134 on the list. It was by the Fugees. The album is The Score, which was released in 1996. So this is an excellent socially conscious hip hop album. And also in connection with this, on a previous episode of our podcast, Ryan Gray of the reggae rock band Street Pharmacy also commented on the impact that this album had on him and on his music. And he even mentioned that when he was young, this album even opened him up to certain social issues that prior to that, he just didn't give much thought to. So it's definitely, it'd be good to listen to that clip right now. And also, one of the members of the Fugees, Lauryn Hill, her debut solo album, Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, was also number 10 on the list. And that's definitely an album that's well worth the listen. So next, we got Sly and the Family Stone, who actually has 2 albums that made the list. One was the album Stand, which was released in 1969, so that was 119 on the list. And then there's the album There's a Riot Going On, which was released in 1971, and that was 82 on the list. So both albums are powerful and contain numerous socially conscious statements. Stan is a bit more optimistic and accessible, while There's a Riot Going On is darker, but probably even more compelling. So both albums are definitely well worth the listen. And they're both influential in the development of funk as well. So that's a good thing to take note if you're interested in the historical developments of different musical genres. So the next album is Lemonade by Beyonce, which was released in 2016. So this was also featured on the Best Protest Albums list of the 2010s. And this is a prime example of how in music, the political often intersects with the personal. And also there's tunes such as Formation and Freedom, which heavily address themes of Black and woman empowerment. So the next album on the list is by Kendrick Lamar, to Pimp a Butterfly, which was released in 2015. So this was number 19 on the list. And this was actually one of 3 albums for Lamar. His 2017 album, Damn, made 175 on the list. And his 2012 album, Good Kid, Mad City, was 115 on the list. So one of the criticisms I've been hearing about this list is there's too many newer albums. And I think to a certain extent, that can be a valid criticism, because if an album's only been out for a few years, you can make the argument it hasn't really had enough time to establish its legacy. But in this case, this album, I mean, all of Lamar's albums are exceptional, but this album, To Pimp a Butterfly, this was a truly landmark album. From the moment it was released, you knew that this was a historically significant musical document. And it's an album that continues to resonate even more in connection with the Black Lives Matter movement and in connection with what's going on in the current political climate. So in all likelihood, this is an album that's going to continue to even grow in stature. I mean, it'd be great if it doesn't, because it becomes no longer as relevant, but it's an album that's it's definitely truly significant. So the next album on the list is The Clash, London Calling, which made number 16 on the list, and it was released in 1979. This was actually one of 3 albums by The Clash. Sanadista, the 1980 album, made it to 339 on the list, and their self-titled debut, which was released in 1977, made it to 102 on the list. So all 3 of these albums are absolute classic, but London Calling in particular is a truly landmark album. So it's the beginning of some of their experimentation outside of traditional punk. I mean, even their first 2 albums, there was a little bit of influence with reggae, but they even expand upon that for London Calling. Of course, with Sanadista, that's by far the most ambitious and experimental album. But Sanadista, most would agree, was a little bit uneven musically. So London Calling was basically the perfect representation of what made The Clash so important. So The Clash, they're in the Protest Music Hall of Fame. So there's a write-up about that. And I also have a write-up on the website in connection with some of their notable protest songs. So you can check that out. But very few bands are as important as The Clash when it comes to the historical development of political music. So the next band, or the next album, was number 15 on the list by Public Enemy. It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, which was released in 1988. And also another one of the classic albums, Fear of a Black Planet, was 176 on the list, and that was released in 1990. So basically both albums are landmark albums and are two of the most important political rap albums of all time. And also both of the albums are in the Protest Music Hall of Fame as well. So definitely are worth checking out. And Public Enemy also recently released a new album, which is worth checking out. They continue to be relevant, and we need their music even more than ever. So the next album on the list is by Stevie Wonder, Songs in the Key of Life, which was released in 1976. And this was number 4 on the list. So Stevie Wonder is someone who's no stranger to social commentary with his music. Like, for example, his 1972 album Talking Book and his 1973 album Inversions, which also made this Rolling Stone list as well. Both of those albums contain socially conscious material as well. But this album is arguably his most socially conscious and is definitely worth a listen. And then the number 1 album on the Rolling Stone list, which is definitely a true classic, is Marvin Gaye's What's Going On, which was released in 1971. So this album is widely viewed as the first concept album within the soul music genre. And it deals with themes of police brutality, environmental harm, racial and economic injustice, among many other social issues as well. So originally, back when the list was published in 2003, it was number 6 on the list. But with everything that's going on, this album resonates even more so. And also, this album, along with this title track, are both in the Protest Music Hall of Fame. So these are just a few of the notable socially conscious albums that made the Rolling Stone album list. Also, I'm just going to briefly share the albums that are inducted into the Protest Music Hall of Fame. So there's 10 albums, and some of these are actually on the Rolling Stone list as well. But there's a couple I want to highlight because we talked about potential blind spots within the Rolling Stone list. I think this kind of highlights that as well. So the albums that were inducted in the Protest Music Hall of Fame is Dust Bowl Ballads, which was released in 1940 by Woody Guthrie. The next album, Talkin' Union and Other Union Songs, which was released in 1941 by the Almanac Singers. Then the next album, The Times They All Changin', which was released in 1964 by Bob Dylan. Then It's My Way, which was released in 1964 by Buffy St. Marie. The next album, Nina Simone in Concert, which was released in 1964. The next album is I Ain't Marching Anymore, which was released in 1965 by Phil Oakes. The next album, What's Going On, by Marvin Gaye, so that was also on the Rolling Stone list. Then we got It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back and Fear of a Black Planet by Public Enemy. And then we got the Rage Against the Machine, their self-titled debut. So one of the possible things about the Rolling Stones list, like we talk about blind spots, is there's very few albums that were recorded before the 1960s. So there's only a small handful of albums that were released in the 50s. The oldest album on the list was released in 1955 by Frank Sinatra, his album In the Wee Small Hours, which was 282 on the list. So of course it's understandable that compared to other decades, there wasn't as many albums released prior to the 60s, but they're all albums that have been released, and there are some very significant and important albums. Like we mentioned, 2 of the albums that are in the Protest Music Hall of Fame. Like Dust Bowl Ballads is widely considered one of the first concept albums, and Woody Guthrie is definitely a legendary figure in the historical developments of music. But we got the album by the Almanac Singers, Talking Union and Other Union Songs. That's another significant album, which I know is also in the National Registry as part of the Library of Congress. So they're all older albums that deserve a spotlight as well. So I'm not saying that to be critical of the list, because obviously when you're getting feedback from a number of individuals, that's probably a time period that's going to be more likely neglected. But it's just to kind of spotlight the fact that there are all other albums that deserve a spotlight as well. So concerning this idea of 500 albums, I plan on doing something similar with protest albums. So I want to start a project which is going to spotlight 500 notable protest albums. But as mentioned, on my website, it's not going to be presented in numerical order. So when the list is presented, it's going to be presented chronologically based on when the album was released. So I will be posting a Google Doc on the website. So individuals that visit the website and listen to the podcast will have an opportunity to give their feedback. But I also plan on doing something similar to what Rolling Stone did. I plan on reaching out to different musicians and journalists and music historians to get their feedback as well. So of course, I don't have the clout of a Rolling Stone, so there's a possibility that individuals may not have the same degree of willingness to get involved. But I figured it's worth a shot to get feedback, and I think it'll be good to chronicle different notable political protest albums. Also in connection with this, I still plan on doing my decade list. So I'm still in the process of compiling the list of the 100 albums of the 90s. So the list itself is basically compiled. I just gotta finish doing the write-ups. And then as mentioned before, there's gonna be a list for the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, and then a list of notable albums released prior to the 60s. So we also mentioned the Protest Music Hall of Fame throughout our podcast, and we previously had a podcast episode that outlined what's involved and what is the objective of that music archival project. So the online nomination poll for the 2020 Protest Music Hall of Fame, it will be open to September 30th, so just a couple more days. And then the results of the poll will be used to create a long list nominee poll. So this concludes episode 19. So to leave any feedback for the website or podcast, you can do so through the contact page of the website, Ongoing History of ProtestMusic.com, or you can message me through Twitter at Tunes of Protest. I also started a Patreon page, which I outlined during last week's episode. So patrons will get exclusive content. So that will include bonus episodes, early access, and video content. Like for example, the video of my episode 14 interview with Elise Okasami, who performs under the name Oceanator, that is now posted on the Patreon. Also concerning this episode, I created a secret Spotify list which features protest music from the 500 albums. And along with the albums we discussed today, it also features a number of songs from other albums we haven't discussed. So you can support at www.patreon.com/ongoing history of protest music. So that's patreon.com/ ongoing history of protest music. And all support is appreciated. And when I say all support, I'm not just even talking about Patreon. I'm talking about even just listening to the podcast, checking out the website, and leaving feedback. It is all appreciated. So thanks for listening, and please stay safe.